Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me very great pleasure to welcome here in Weimar at the stage of the Deutsches Nationaltheater Michael Dobson from Stratford-upon-Avon and our very special guest of honor, Sir Kenneth Brenner. Please welcome.
Gosh, what a welcome on a Sunday morning. Thank you.
Good. Shakespeare Freunde. It's one of the only words of German I know, and it's one that this organization gives me so many opportunities and reasons for using. And I'm immensely grateful to have been brought to Weimar once more for this conversation with Sir Kenneth. It's not the first time that Sir Kenneth and I have been in the same theatre at the same time, but usually I've been sort of up there somewhere, having a fantastic time while Sir Kenneth has been down here working very hard. The first time, I think, was almost exactly 30 years ago, when I remember sitting sort of up there in a theatre not unlike this one, the old Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford, and sitting there thinking, God, here's a man exactly the same age as me, from a fairly similar background, and here am I with an unfinished doctoral thesis, and there he is playing this great role of Henry V for the Royal Shakespeare Company, and obviously things have just got much worse from there onwards, since Sir Kenneth has really added new layers of meaning to the word overachiever. He's been nominated for Oscars in 7 different categories. And I could fill up all the time we've got just mentioning Ken's work and mentioning the awards he's had. I will mention, of course, only one of the many awards, forms of recognition he's had for his work, which is the most important, which is that he's an honorary fellow of the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon. And I'm glad that the Deutsche Shakespeare Gesellschaft has also noticed his talent, as we did. I want to start with talking about some of Sir Ken's most recent work in Shakespeare, which is that a week ago today, BBC Radio broadcast a new radio production of Antony and Cleopatra, which was very beautiful, with Alex Kingston,
who's very beautiful.
Yes. Well, indeed, and even more so on radio. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you've done a lot of sound recordings and some very notable work for radio, which is a medium that I think Shakespeare scholars sometimes neglect. What is it that attracts you about doing Shakespeare in a sound medium?
It's that phrase, "We'll hear a play tonight." We'll hear a play tonight, says Hamlet. And when I was, we have lots of parallels. We had a lovely time talking, Michael and I, about all the various Shakespeares that we'd seen together. I'm sure we would all perhaps have joint memories of great performances. But an early time was on radio, Vivat Rex, which was listening on an old radio. I would have been about 14, 15, to, for the first time on the radio, Derek Jacobi as Richard II, John Hurt actually in the Marley, Edward II, and to get a sense of the history cycle for the first time. Hearing it was very vivid and marvelous, and subsequently the experience of hearing great voices and great intelligence respond to the lines has been marvelous. And I've had the great good fortune. I've been in 2 productions of King Lear, audio productions. One with John Gielgud as King Lear, in which I played Edmund, and I played the Fool with Paul Schofield as King Lear. And one of the great moments of my sound Shakespeare life was all of these very distinguished actors. Alec McCowan, who played the Fool famously to Schofield's Lear in '64, I think, at Stratford, played Gloucester in this sound production. Harriet Walter, a great Cleopatra, also a distinguished fellow of the Shakespeare Institute, played Goneril, and and Richard McCabe, marvelous actor, playing Edgar. I remember all of the actors walking away, just backing up into the walls as Schofield slowly moved towards the microphone before he began in his inimitable voice to sing "Blow winds and crack your cheeks," and so he went on. And to hear those kinds of voices was great. The same thing, Gielgud did a thing on "And My Poor Fool is Hanged," which seemed to begin at the lowest note ever for a human being to be able to hear, let alone say, and travel up through, it seemed, about 8 octaves to the end of the line. So the music of Shakespeare is what's drawn me to the radio and to the audio world.
Yeah, I mean, something that struck me about the Antony and Cleopatra was how the soundscapes were incredibly realistic, and it solved the problem of hoisting Antony up to the monument, because you could hear that he was somewhere else and that he was then coming in. And so it's once a very realistic medium, but one in which it doesn't seem incongruous that people are speaking in verse. You know, that it can sort of, you can imagine it in both ways at once.
I think that's true, and you know, as people say sometimes on radio, the pictures are better.
Yeah.
And you get to, as an actor, you get to taste the language. From very early on, I was very interested in the articulation of Shakespeare, and a note that I often give actors and try to give to myself is to do with the sort of the architecture of the language, consonants being vital, middle and end consonants, and the radio encourages you to absolutely feel the fabric of the language and make sure that all the conjunctives are nicely touched in as well, and then it becomes a different kind of experience. And when you're doing things on the radio over the week or so where it happens, it's you feel very full of the language. So it has an experiential effect on you that's unusual, and it's a very nice taste, a very nice reminder to take into a rehearsal for a performance in the theatre.
You've often worked on a Shakespeare play in one medium, such as theatre, and later worked on that same play again in a different medium, such as film. Is there hope that you might want to do more with Antony and Cleopatra, either as a director or as an actor or as both?
I think I would. We were just touching earlier on the challenges on a superficial level. People say that the parts are uneven, and that Antony, who dies at the end of the 4th act, somehow perhaps sort of diminishes a little as a leading role for an actor. I didn't find that in playing it, and I found it. Certainly, I find it's an obvious thing to say, but very cinematic as it shifts location, and very glamorous. And I'm not going to mention the name of the play that I am doing at the moment. I did a play last summer. It's about a Scottish king that Shakespeare wrote, and I'm going to do it again in New York in about a month's time. So I think, with great respect to this theatre, I think I'm probably going to, at least I won't mention the name of it, I think, unless I do it by accident, and then please convince me it's all going to be okay. But the experience of, I think that they are second cousins, that character, the Scottish king and Antony, and, you know, men who know themselves very much as soldiers, and I enjoyed playing very much, Shakespeare seems to invite this, I enjoyed very much worshipping my wife in both cases. There's a very strong sense in the plays of this tremendous devotion and passion that I found central to playing. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but it was it was very releasing. And as you know, Ian McKellen has this theory that there are no happy marriages in Shakespeare. I'm sure you all have a view on that. It's all fine, you know, when they get to the end of the comedies and the wedding starts or the dancing starts. It's after that you think that there might be a problem with some people thinking exceptions, including Ian, who thinks maybe exceptions are the Percys in the Henry IV plays. Or indeed the Scottish couple, who, aside from the fact that they blocked their copybook rather by killing a king, I suppose, and becoming tyrants, but in terms of their own actual relationship, it's quite functioning and passionate, and they seem to talk to each other at least for a large part of the play. But there's something in both cases, in Anthony and in the Scottish play, where, for me, in a very pleasing way, the part of playing the part was simply being devoted to the other character. Yeah. And so I feel as though much of my performance was given to me by, in this case, Alex Kingston, in both cases.
So it would be a sort of, I mean, for that remark of Macbeth's where he compares himself to Antony, and you know, Shakespeare's clearly got Plutarch open in front of him while he's doing the Scottish play before he moves on to the Egyptian play. So it would be a logical kind of thing for you to move on from that Scottish play to that Egyptian play.
Well, I think that yes, it seems to be that there's a kind of natural thing that's happening. It's partly to do with the age you are, and in both cases, you know, they both mention the passing of the years, particularly sort of pertinent in the life of a soldier, or indeed in the life of a would-be self-styled lover as well, as Antony might be deemed to be. So yes, they have strong connections, I think.
Now, something that was new about the Scottish play in Manchester was that you were able to exploit the new technology, which the National and the Royal Shakespeare Company and a lot of other companies are using too, whereby you can be performing live in the theatre and yet being watched in cinemas all over the world. Yeah. How have you found that? I mean, is it a successful hybrid between Shakespeare on screen and Shakespeare on the stage, or is it something else again?
I think it's evolving, I think. I had a friend who saw it in the cinema and was very disappointed that they didn't have literally a view from the stalls. Our production is traverse, and so the audience were on either side, and the television version of it had cameras at either end and above and on the sides. So in that sense, it was trying to make a kind of a fusion, if you like, of the theatrical experience, which was quite intense. You know, the production has rain and mud and fire, and everything's quite close. So it was a very sort of interactive experience. But this particular friend felt as though they wanted to have only the theatrical view. They didn't want what she felt was the halfway house of a sort of semi-involvement with... inevitably, with the lack of time, the cameras had only a brief rehearsal time to try and catch the excitement of it. However, most people I spoke to enjoyed it very, very much. From the point of view of the acting, all the actors came up to me beforehand and said, "Are you going to change your performance and make it smaller and for the camera?" And I felt that we shouldn't do that. That our first obligation was to people who'd paid tickets to come and see us live, and that in any case we were in such a small space that a basic quality of the production that we were trying to maximize was this sense of eavesdropping on the, you know, psychological drama at the heart of it. So. It was amazing on the night that we did this, you know, we had 5,000 people in a car park outside the theatre watching it on a big screen, friends ringing up afterwards who were in cinemas all over the country, you know, sold out all over the place. Same things happened with many recent productions. So people are discovering that it's quite clear that for audiences who either don't have the money or the time to get to London or to these productions at Stratford or wherever they might be, it's a tremendous way of getting a front row seat, and I think this nature of the style of it should it be more or less theatrical or more or less filmic? That question's being asked with every production, I think, and so it's. But it seemed many people were delighted. And it certainly keeps you on your mettle when you. I've had a couple of experiences like this where you're just reminded before you go on. Rob Ashford, the brilliant co-director of that production, said before we went on that, he said, remember, it's usually 270 people watching, and tonight it's 100,000 people watching live, which more or less guarantees that you're going to paraphrase. I remember, I used to worry about this and then thought, you have to, adrenaline does what adrenaline does. I remember just standing in the wings here at the Barbican Theatre in 1992, in December. I was playing Hamlet, or about to play Hamlet, and the national press were there, and I was about as nervous as I've ever been before any performance, and I thought for the first time, not to be too graphic about it, I thought I was going to vomit in the wings. I was so nervous. You just feel with that part, and I was 31 years old, and it's the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it's London, and it was the whole Hamlet. It's a big deal. You feel like you're at the acting Olympics, and you're going to have to run pretty quickly. And I thought, Jesus Christ, I hope I don't forget any of this. The lines, I mean. I certainly wasn't going to forget what it was like in the wings. That day, back in the old days, people used to smoke. And during that day, I'd been in the rehearsal room. I didn't smoke at that. So I did smoke later in my life for a brief period, but I didn't smoke then. But I noticed in the rehearsal room that people were smoking, and they happened to smoke. This is not an advert. I have no relationship to the company I'm about to mention. There were cigarettes called Dunhill. Dunhill cigarettes were lying about. People were smoking quite heavily, actually, all rather nervous like me for the evening to come. And there I was, thinking I was going to be sick, and then I came on, and then I turned around, and, he doesn't say much to begin with, and then they go off, and then, that this too solid flesh would melt, etc. And then later on, I continued to feel very nervous until I got to the point where that one may smile and be a villain, at least I am sure it may be so in Denmark. I was still very nervous at that point and said that one may smile and be a villain, at least I am sure it may be so with Dunhill. Now, frankly, I waited for that reaction, and nothing happened. I calmed down immediately because I thought, well, they clearly didn't believe that I was ever going to say something like, I couldn't have said with Dunhill. I could almost feel the critics. No, I didn't hear that. No, I didn't. It's Denmark. It's just Denmark. And then I thought, excuse my language, I thought, fuck it, I'm going to enjoy the rest of this and blow the nerves, and so from that point onwards, I realised that it was,
Well, that's fantastic.
Playing Hamlet was to be enjoyed, not feared.
Yeah. Well, How splendid that among your other distinctions you've corrected Shakespeare's failure ever to mention tobacco. That was the one time he did.
I wish I could tell you it was the only time I did that, but I've made up some nonsense. Often, as you know, that people make it up in iambic pentameter. It's possible to come up with a lot of old nonsense, but rhythmically correct.
To go back to that rhythmic correctness, and to go back earlier in your career, and as you this first great milestone, certainly in your international profile, and of course everybody's been watching your films here all week, is transforming your performance as Henry V in a production in a theatre into a movie. And I'm trying to think back into your earlier life and wonder what it is in your training or your experience that sort of equipped you or prepared you or gave you a sort of repertoire of techniques, not just for acting Shakespeare, but also for directing it for the screen. I mean, what are the points where you first remember encountering Shakespeare in televised or cinematic form? Where does that factor in?
Well, I suppose that, like you, two things are always going on. One was I was come from a working class Belfast family, and I was exposed to popular culture. Went to the pictures together. We watched a lot of television. There weren't really any books in the house. My parents were both very smart people, but we didn't come from a literary background. Didn't go to the theatre much. The first time I remember seeing Shakespeare on screen was Richard Chamberlain as Hamlet on television. I think Gilgud as the ghost. I think it was Michael Redgrave as Claudius. And I was just struck by the fact that this fellow played Dr. Kildare. So I was watching the bloke off the other bit of the telly, now speaking funny, but very arrestingly. So it was a Sunday evening. I remember being I remember sort of doing something else, and then being drawn into it, and drawn in essentially to a ghost story, I suppose, is what I was caught by. And then, you know, I just found at school, I had very good teachers at school, and the sort of interest in language and poetry sprang from that. There was just a feeling for it. I would say that an Irish background gives you that. You know, there's no shame about loving words. There's no sort of shame about sort of feeling, having a kind of reaction. So I was talking earlier about sort of experiential reaction to the sound, to the music of poetry, and at big family gatherings, you know, people would often come up with a story or a poem, certainly lots of songs, and so one gave oneself to that. So there was always a feeling that one gave oneself to language, but actually in terms of entertainment, what I often did was watch the television or go to the pictures. Those two things just sort of kept, somehow I didn't believe that they couldn't exist together. So things like the Chamberlain Hamlet was the beginning of understanding maybe that could be the case. And I suppose when it became clear that acting was a possibility, which was just through doing plays at school, there was a sort of both the passion and the zeal, the enthusiasm for doing it, and the feeling that one wanted to share that same thing, which I felt I was aware did in England have sometimes a sort of excluding or exclusive quality, which is this poetry, or this complex, or some might say rarefied text or author, could coexist with means of popular entertainment that I thought in. So high and low culture, you might say, were already the kind of handshake between or the possibility of a handshake between those two things was already sort of in my bones, and I think I had a bit of a working class chip about it as well. And so so I suppose I combined the two things that I loved. You know, that's how it started.
And they were much more separated when we were growing up. The high culture and ITV telly, you know, they were much more distinct. Yeah. Are there things from your training that continually come back to you? Because you did amateur theatre, you went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and then you get taken on by the RSC. I mean, were you? What sort of activities did they give you to develop you as an actor? I mean, did you recite sonnets with John Barton, as everyone is supposed to do in Stratford?
I did. I remember being, we were very in awe. I was in awe of, I was a complete devotee of all at the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's an absolutely magnificent institution and peopled with amazing folk, legendary folk, and he was one of them. I loved him because he also he walked around. I won the John Barton Stage Fighting Prize at RADA, and I was thrilled. We met him, and we met this he had a beard in which, with no disrespect, things appeared to be living. And he was, I remember asking Patrick Stewart about him. He said, the only thing you need to know about John Barton is he's a marvellous man, but he's had too many quail's eggs in his life. So there was something about the sort of richness. The glasses were at a tilt. The cardigan was here. It was as if he was in the middle of a great thought at all times. And so you were just trying to sort of catch a bit of that as you went. But I did some of the sonnet classes. They were rather scary. Patricia Routledge, a quite magnificent actress, but a very terrifying person, was playing Mistress Quickly in Henry V, and she would just she would give you notes as she passed you. She was rather regal. I mean, wonderfully regal. I found her very sexy as well. Sexy woman, but she was scary. So she'd walk past you. She'd go past you in the morning, and she'd go, "Young man, interfere with the verse at your peril." She would do that, and if you had messed something up, I remember I corpsed in Love's Labour's Lost one night. She walked past me the next morning and went, "I saw what you did last night, young man. I was disgusted." So Sonic classes remind me of those moments of working with Patricia. You're never quite sure when you said good morning whether there would be a frosty or a warm welcome. But she cared about that. So did a wonderful actor called Harold Innocent.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So no, we did all of that, and we were passionate about it. I was always on the stage hours before the show would go up. For me, like you said, and it's funny, this theatre is about as steep as the old Memorial Theatre at Stratford. That's where I first saw my Shakespeare. So you literally sat like that. You know, you were so. And I loved the actors whose faces were up, and you could see them, and you could see everything. It was a fantastic way of understanding how to command a big theatre. And I was so grateful when you're at the back like that to be given the play by the actors. The RSC helped me understand how to do that. But I hasten to add that for me it was sheer and complete and utter pleasure from start to finish. There wasn't anything like the word work attached to anything that I did. It was just, in fact, one was so overexcited all the way through. I mean, I still am, basically. But that I used to come on, and I remember Anthony Scher said to me, he was watching me on the I don't know, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He was in the canteen at Stratford, and I was wondering about. I would always do most of the part of Henry V before doing it in the evening, like you're practicing the piano or whatever. So you're just practicing. And I came off, and he was in the green room. He said, "What are you doing? What are you doing out there? Are you just wandering about?" I said, "Well, I'm doing the part." He said, "It's fucking 5 o'clock in the afternoon." I said, "Won't you be doing it this evening?" I said, "Yes, but I love it. I love it." I said, "This is for me." I was in the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. I said, "What about these ghosts? You're on a stage here. Olivier was here. You think of the performances, I mean, you just feel it. You feel it in the fabric of the theatre. This is a marvelous. I couldn't get over it. I couldn't get over that. I was a kid from Belfast. I'm 23 years old. I'm playing Henry V at Stratford. It was like having a chilled glass of champagne every day with every breath you took.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for sharing it with the audiences, because we had it too. But nonetheless, after working with the RSC, which in that period went in for a lot of design, and directors were very strong. And I remember your production of, Adrian Noble's production of Henry V, that gantry with the French army sort of being lit in gold armour and coming up and down. You've set up your own theatre company in which the policy seemed to be to let actors direct and sort of displace the director to some extent. I mean, were there things that... was that to compensate for a particular kind of Shakespeare, or to try and find kinds of Shakespeare production that you felt nobody else was doing at the time?
We did feel at the time a little overwhelmed by the system that meant that on the first day you were shown a costume design and a design for the play, which would sometimes seem as though it was confining. No, I'm not suggesting this was a particularly reasonable response. This was professional people had worked hard enough to think ahead on your behalf, and if I was looking at it now, I'd think maybe slightly differently. But then the idea that the rehearsal process might unearth things that you might be wise to capitalize on in the production was strong, and if you felt that pre-decided key elements of the show, or even those things that might dictate the performance, were already in place, then that was something that it seemed we might shift. So the idea of the Renaissance Theatre Company was just to put performance at the center of it, and basically allow for as much of what came out of the rehearsals with the actors to be exploited as possible. It isn't always practically possible when it comes to design, so because things have to be built and made before perhaps the great discovery in rehearsal has occurred, if it occurs. So we met like-minded people, and I had worked with Judi Dench and with Derek Jacobi and Geraldine McEwen, all really, truly great actors, and they all had very strong instincts about particular plays. And this particular policy, if you like, was very much in tune with the way they wished to approach their first jobs as directors. And they were all They were all very open to that. So it's not to say that design wasn't very important to us, but it was performance, and it was performance and text. So they were all, as you might expect, very brilliant textual analysts, in addition to being fine actors.
And somehow, in between being an actor manager of your own acting company, attracting and keeping some of the best theatrical talent in the country, and touring extensively and reaching new audiences in the theatre, somehow, between 1984 and 1989, you do this other extraordinary thing. Because again, I remember arriving, I finally got a job. It's an assistant professorship in somewhere relatively obscure in the Midwest in America, and I arrived to take it up, and there's a movie of Henry V on at the cinema, and people are queuing up for it, and I thought, oh, it's him again. And suddenly, cinema audiences worldwide are seeing this movie of Henry V at a time when Shakespeare movies had really been sort of viewed as impossible for a generation, pretty much. And suddenly, whereas some classical actors have been complaining for years that no matter what recognition they get in the theatre, they get tiny walk-on parts as villains in the movies. And you simultaneously suddenly emerge as an international film star and an international star film director at the same time. Do you have any explanation at all as to how this happened?
Luck is an understatement by way of attributing a word to what went on. We had our own first couple of seasons with the Renaissance Theatre Company were of the kind that were sort of Mickey and Judy, let's put the show on right here. We, the first play of the first season was a play that I wrote. I had acquired what seemed to be an enormous sum of money at that time, about £20,000, which was my entire sort of career earnings from television, etc. And with a brilliant instinct, I invested all of this in the play and lost all of it. It was a disaster. The first play was a disaster, so nothing in the bank. Then we did a one-man show with John Sessions about Napoleon, which turned out to be a brilliant cult success because he was brilliant in it. But we were about to do this season of plays. I suppose I'd neglected to tell Judi Dench and Derek Jacobi and Geraldine McEwen that we didn't, strictly speaking, have the money to do these plays yet, but that it would all come. And a man came along called Stephen Evans. He was a former stockbroker. He made and lost his fortune a couple of times. He was interested to get into the world of theatre and film. He said, and he came along and saw us, and I thought that he was some kind of crank. I was in the middle of the technical rehearsal for Napoleon. It was going disastrously. Everything, it was all highly dramatic. Everything was very dramatic. We're all exhausted, and it was all hairbreadth scrapes everywhere. I saw him. I said to our producer, Dave Parfit, take this. Oh, this guy rang. Please, take him. You deal with him, please. And they went and did a tour of the theatre and came back an hour later. I said, oh, God, what was that like? He said, here's a cheque for £10,000. I said, what? Where is he? Let me give him a hug. I thought you didn't want to see him. I want to see him now. I want to see him. And so he then came in. He financed Twelfth Night, which was the first show that really got us going, and helped bring in the money for those 3 shows. During it, he said to me, and what would you like to do after this? I said, I'd like to direct a film of Shakespeare's Henry V. He said, have you ever directed a film before? I said, no. He said, have you ever directed before? I said, no. He said, what makes you think you'll be any good? I said, I don't know. I just have a really strong feeling that it might work. The paper-thin argument is, I've got a really strong feeling. So I didn't win him over with a great intellectual argument. We talked about how and why, and I explained the pictures that were in my head, and then laid it out in a screenplay, and he found the money. I mean, it was right up to the last minute. We were on, we were off, we were on, we were off. David Putnam, as you may know, great English producer, said to me, with 3 weeks to go to the beginning of shooting, he said, I just have to tell you that this film will collapse. It will collapse. Either 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after principal photography begins, and your international film career will be dead. It will be, he said, have no illusions about this, it will be dead. So he pulled out. He was going to be involved, and he just felt the money was so shaky. But somehow Stephen did it, and then the film played the following May at Cannes, and the first card I received was from a very, very gracious and funny card from David Putnam, Lord Putnam as he then was, that began simply with the phrase, "Well, what do I know?"
And they said history would never repeat itself after Decca turned down the Beatles, you know, but there we are. And you go on to do something else impossible, which is make a successful film adaptation of a Shakespeare comedy, with Much Ado. You know, an incredibly happy film for its audiences, and premiered, or at least I think one of the first American screenings was at a conference rather like this, except of the Shakespeare Association of America. I remember seeing it with Stanley Wells, and absolutely loving it. And that film broke another apparent taboo in that it had Hollywood film actors acting alongside English stage actors. You know, I mean, how did you put that together? How did it work?
Well, I mean, it was partly that the film was more expensive than Henry V, and there was the Samuel Goldwyn Jr. was the producer with Stephen Evans and David Parfitt, who were absolutely vital and integral to the whole thing. And there was this sense that the something we were trying to find in the play and in the decision to do it, in this case in Tuscany, was a sort of glamour, but ultimately the idea was, who did we think would be best for the roles, and largely, I suppose, this idea that neither, as it were, nationality nor ethnicity were any bar to doing Shakespeare well, and that there might be, you know, ways in which the casting of that film could perhaps spread that message, but at base also just try and introduce some fine performances, of which I would cite, say, Denzel Washington as somebody who brings to Don Pedro a kind of gravitas that I remember seeing when I watched him in a film called Glory, an Edgewick film about the American Civil War called Glory. And I remember just a quality of openness and intelligence and maturity about him that I felt the character of Don Pedro would respond very well to. All of these characters can be played a trillion ways, and they're full of the great multi-layered mystery and quality of Mr. Shakespeare, but the sort of longing and the loneliness in that character is often, I think, sort of alone by the end of the play, and there's something in his relationship with Beatrice that seems to carry beyond what is said, and so I felt, and I think I was right to feel that he would bring to that this intelligence and a certain melancholy and a certain sort of loneliness of soul that he did beautifully. And it was nice to have in a character like Don John, the sort of straight up and down sexiness of Keanu Reeves. He came after that project with tremendous passion. He was so keen to be in it. He was summarily dismissed by various people at the time because he was in the Bill and Ted movies, which were very funny, but which people assumed therefore made him stupid or under-talented or something, as if those were easy tricks to pull off. But anyway, so it was a combination, partly, which I've done across some of the other films, a sort of celebration of the kind of collaboration you would hope, and not the clash of, you know, the kind of multi-national and multicultural kind of qualities inside the casting of the film that in itself produces a certain kind of energy. It was an exciting moment you end up putting this sort of summer stock company together, and so there we were, experiencing all the kinds of things that happen with groups of actors, but to be in Tuscany on a Sunday evening at the beginning of a rehearsal process, and 2 weeks later in a hot room running the entire thing with people like, you know, really running everything, but like it were a play, but having to say to Denzel Washington and Keanu Reeves, now you're on the horses now, and now you're riding up this, but we're only in a room inside a villa. That was so everybody suddenly looks like they're in a Monty Python film, but it's very, very bonding. One of my favorite English actor anecdotes, just as you bring up the idea of, certain differences in casting, is a great friend of mine whose name, he shall remain nameless, but on that first evening, he said, as we stood on the terrace of this, the Vigna Maggia, the Vines of May, wonderful villa in Tuscany where we shot the movie, and he stood there and we gave them all some wine from the vineyards that they were looking at, some local cheese and, everything that the area has to offer, which is wonderful and beautiful. And he looked out at the hills and we could see forever. And he said, my God, he said, this is unbelievable. It's the 1st of August in the year of our Lord, 1992. We're on the terrace of the Vigna Maggia. We're drinking wine from these vineyards. We're looking out at that amazing view. And we're here to do William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Kenneth, thank you so much. I would pay to do this. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. 3 days later, I'm walking past the catering. The same actor is sitting there under an umbrella, and as I go by, I hear him say, "Fucking pasta again." Actors.
Well, we barely touched on half of what you've done with Shakespeare. We haven't mentioned In the Bleak Midwinter or Love's Labour's Lost or As You Like It as movies, never mind lots of other projects. But time, alas, you have a busy schedule, so does this noble organisation. I will just mention that when we talked about what the format should be of this event today, whether Sir Kenneth should receive the honorary presidentship of the organisation and then talk to you, or whether he should talk first and then receive it. I mean, my own feeling was that the model here should be a play that Sir Kenneth has performed in, of course, Coriolanus, where, of course, he's supposed to be made consul, but he has to show his wounds to the people first. And I think we've probably seen enough wounds to be going on with it. And so, as I call the president back to the stage, I ask you to give your voices to your new honorary president, Sir Kenneth Branagh.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the occasion of its 150th anniversary, the German Shakespeare Society, founded in Weimar in 1864, confers its honorary presidency on Sir Kenneth Branagh. His long creative career as an actor and director on stage and screen has given William Shakespeare's works new relevance for our times and has made them accessible to new audiences. In doing so, Sir Kenneth Branagh has devoted himself to the very same aims for which the German Shakespeare Society continues to strive.
Die Deutsche Shakespeare-Gesellschaft, Sitz Weimar, gegründet 1864, verleiht zum Anlass ihres 150-jährigen Bestehens Sir Kenneth Branagh die Ehrenpräsidentschaft. Sein jahrzehntelanges Wirken als Schauspieler und Regisseur auf der Bühne und im Kino hat die Werke William Shakespeares für unsere Zeit mit neuem Leben erfüllt und neues Publikum für sie gewonnen. Diesen Zielen sieht sich auch die Deutsche Shakespeare-Gesellschaft in ihrer Arbeit verpflichtet.
So thank you so much. Thank you. That's really wonderful and very touching. Thank you, Mike. That's a lovely, lovely conversation, and I enjoyed it very, very much. So well done, you. Thank you. So briefly, to say, as you heard, I was born in Belfast to working-class Irish parents. My mother always insisted that I was a difficult child. At the age of 3, I could speak but could be understood by no one but her. And my Aunt Kathleen, this is true, was convinced that I was German. True story, true family story. In fact, my mother was convinced that I would only ever speak German. The problem lay with my tonsils. They were removed. And I'm very sorry to have to tell you that from that day to this, I have never spoken German again. But how proud my mother and my aunt would be to see me become today an honorary German, and indeed the honorary president of the German Shakespeare Society. I am truly delighted and really touched and thrilled to stand here on this stage where history has been made, political history, theatre history, Shakespeare history, and to wish Shakespeare at 450 years and the German Shakespeare Society at 150 years a very happy birthday. And to remember that amongst other things on this stage, I'm aware, Franz Diegelstedt pioneered the production of Shakespeare's history cycle as a complete work and inspired the rest of the world to see those plays anew. And that, frankly, that kind of German vision influenced my own passion for Shakespeare's histories and for their continuing relevance. Indeed, at about the time we were talking about, I was practically living in second-hand bookshops and purchasing ancient dog-eared copies of Shakespeare, copies that remain with me today and with which I work each time I perform one of these plays, and copies that I shall very happily pass on to other Shakespeareans to come. And it was at that time that I came across this quote of Goethe's. Once I had read an entire play, I stood there like a blind man given the gift of sight by some miraculously healing touch. And I know what he meant. And so later in the theatre with our Renaissance company, we gloried in the rebirth of these great plays for new audiences. And the film that we opened, Henry V, in 1989, which, as you all know, was a crucial year for German history and for world history, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. Shakespeare takes this new medium, it's all his work, this cinema in which surely he would have thrived had it existed in 1600, and effortlessly in film he comments on the way in which history is made and remade, and on the cruel details that the victors in history afterwards sometimes choose to forget, and that Shakespeare's war play makes us also vividly remember. And that questioning of cultural memory, I know, is an issue high on the agenda of the German Shakespeare Society, and it seems to be typical and important that the Society in 1993, as you know, in their first united meeting after 30 years of East-West separation, that they dedicated themselves to this very, very resonant theme, Shakespeare and cultural memory. So in celebration of that, of this great jubilee, I should like, as your new honorary president, to dedicate myself to something. So let us all, as Shakespeare himself has done, defy history and the aging process, and let us agree to meet here 50 years from now and celebrate your 200th and Shakespeare's 500th birthday. What a party we shall have. Age shall not wither us, nor custom stale our infinite variety. I shall be, God willing, 103 years old, in probably second childishness and perhaps mere oblivion, possibly sans eyes, almost certainly sans teeth, but with taste for sure, and with everything that is left of my worldly energies to raise a glass of fine German wine to our friend, our guide, our inspiration, the greatest of all honorary Germans, Wilhelm Shakespeare. And on that occasion, to him and to you, and with thanks for this very deeply appreciated great honor, happy birthday.